Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
Okay. At that time in '66, was there even a thought that the park's boundaries needed attention, or was the focus at the time simply, and that would be the Marble Canyon Dam and Bridge Canyon Dam? Is that right?
Yes, Bridge Canyon Dam, which became known as Havasupai Dam, and then Marble Canyon Dam, located upstream from the park.
So those threats were happening.
Well, the two of them together, had they been built,
right,
would have destroyed the canyon as any kind of a recognizable natural phenomenon. The end result of that would have been not a national park, but the Grand Canyon Industrial Zone. It would have been an environmental disaster, a social, cultural, natural disaster. And I'm only being so emphatic about it because we came close to committing that disaster. Everybody was, on the other side, was convinced that this was the thing you did and we should do. Dam the streams and pump out the electricity.
So again, in 1966, was there a concept that the greater Grand Canyon needed to be an integral whole? What sparked that concept?
All right, the quick answer to that is no. And although there are some ideas of little changes in the boundary, nobody up to that point had the concept of the canyon as a geologic, environmental, topographic entity that ran from, as we now say, the Paria River junction down to Grand Wash Cliffs.
Okay.
And that idea was just not something that was on the radar. It was assumed that when the dams were built, there would probably be some recreation areas or whatnot. It doesn't really matter because they weren't built. And we very quickly, March, as a matter of fact, said what we need to oppose to the dams is the concept of protecting and presenting to the public a complete Grand Canyon National Park. And so a fine man, Martin Litton, I hope we all know who he is, we're told by Dave Bauer, you sit down and draw up some kind of a thing we can use as a bill to take to our friends in Congress, and they'll introduce this as the complete Grand Canyon National Park Act, which will be in opposition, a better vision for the Grand Canyon than 2 dams and an industrial wasteland. So we drew that up. It was introduced in Congress. It was I'm old enough to be able to say without embarrassment, it had many flaws. It was something that we corrected over the years with the central core of taking the whole canyon from the Paria to Grand Wash Cliffs and including the important, let me say the drainage, the streams and the side canyons that run down in it and the plateaus that are cut into it.
Okay.
You can't have a down if you don't have an up.
Hmm.
So, yes, and that bill was, of course, derided and hooted at by the dam builders, but we had it out there.
So, so what were the boundaries of the park like before you came up with this kind of integral Grand Canyon piece of legislation?
Well, when I've been thinking about this, we have to go back to the original ideas, and we see that there are certain things of a particular time which influence how people go about making proposals. But basically, what we ended up with, what the nation ended up with in 1919 was a boundary which came as close to the rim and enclosed what I think they thought of as Powell's Big Hole, running from Nanquit down to, at that time, if I remember right, didn't even make it to Tapeats.
Hmm.
It was a mingy boundary. It did not have any expansive view, which is funny for a man like Powell. Maybe not funny, but it was too bad.
Why do you think that? I mean, I spent a lot of time on this, but I'm just curious. Why do you think that the original boundary of the Grand Canyon was so small? Of the park?
Because that wasn't the original boundary of the canyon. But let me cut right to the core of the chase.
Yes.
And bring out one of the people that I'm not going to call a villain, but whose weight over a period of 50-some, 60-some years almost exceeds anybody else's on Grand Canyon matters. That man was Carl Hayden, who was congressman and then senator from Arizona until he left Congress in 1968, when the time the state was created. And he just exerted enormous influence. He was in the House. Now, no, I'll not indulge in a speculation. So he was in the House because Arizona had just been admitted when finally a bill was brought forward and worked on in Congress, pushed by people like Mather and Albright, who had just taken charge of the brand new National Park Service. And this was one of the first on their agendas. And they wanted to launch a Grand Canyon National Park. Now, without going too far back in history, let me just say, at this point, the key thing is that Carl Hayden looked at this. No, I can't. Sorry, I got to go back. We got to include the Grand Canyon National Monument.
Okay.
We all remember the hero Theodore Roosevelt. Old Teddy came to the rim of the canyon, 1902, and fell in love with it and made the great speech and recommended to Congress that there be a national park, but he didn't do anything until the Antiquities Act was passed, and he or somebody else had the brilliant idea of saying, well, if there's anything antique around here, it's the Grand Canyon. So let's go ahead and create a Grand Canyon National Monument to protect it while we figured out how to get a park. And that monument that they created was so restrictive. The idea was, in a monument, you couldn't do anything. And that was largely because they were meant to protect archaeological ruins, small places that if you weren't careful, you could crush out of existence. The idea of using it for something as extensive as the canyon was pretty wild. Although my point has always been, the Antiquities Act says you're supposed to make it in accord with what's necessary to protect it. So I think Teddy and all the people at that time should have looked at it and said, hey, we need to go up to Paria and we need to go down to Grand Wash Cliffs, because if you don't protect it all, you aren't really protecting it. They didn't do that. That's fantasy. Forgive me for that. But we do have a national monument in 1908 and 1910. We've got people who want to make a park bill. And now we have Carl Hayden, who is the only person from Arizona in the House, and he's controlling it. And to Carl Hayden, the important thing was, you know, you can't do anything in this park. We've got to open up this park. So for him, changing the national monument to the national park was not a protective thing. It was an opening up thing. I think many of us know that there was in that legislation mining. There was in that legislation an allowance for reclamation, and so on. It was, well, let me just say, and one of the other consequences of that the boundary was drawn just as close to the rim as they could, because they wanted to allow for development on the rim. They didn't want to cut out any of the grazing people. They thought about railroads, aside from the Santa Fe, which of course was already there.
So thinking about Hayden, then his vision was use. And
yes.
it seems as though that would have been the, in quotes, normal vision for the times. And you almost have to flash forward 100 years, though not quite, more like 60 or 50, to get to a vision of wanting to preserve the landscape for the landscape's form.
Well, I don't think that's fair, Tom.
Okay.
There were people of vision at that time. Believe it or not, the head of the Forest Service wanted to establish a park out of the monument and the forest, because of course, since the monument was in the forest, he was administering. He didn't want that responsibility, but he recognized what was going on here, and he was in no way alone. In 1910, a proposal was put forward and presented to then President Taft, to run to create a park which would have been even larger than the area I'm talking about. It was taken up the Havasupai Reservation and run clear up to including all of Marble, and great swaths of grazing country. I mean, it was a crazy idea, but I'm just trying to make this point.
Yes.
That at that time, where there was nothing settled about this, a good part of the debate was by people who recognized the wonders that were there and that should be protected, and in a way that could be presented to the people, all the people.
Okay, so then your point that Hayden played a major, if you will, a blocking role in allowing that kind of vision?
No, not blocking role. He had a vision. His vision was of Arizona, prosperous, large, the kind of vision that any boomer and booster has.
Okay.
When they come out to the West and they look around and say, this is big country, let's fill it with people, let's fill it with buildings, let's make it a great place to live. And that was his view. What was good for Arizona's economy, for building, that was what Carl Hayden wanted to promote. It's not that he didn't take an interest in the canyon as such, but that's not what guided his philosophy about how to go about creating a national park. That national park he created, he wanted to fit into an economic scheme for Arizona.
Okay, so in 66, 67, when you and Martin Litton and David Brower are starting to look at the Grand Canyon going, we need a piece of legislation that goes from Lee's Ferry to the Grand Wash that looks at the Grand Canyon as an integral whole, you weren't the first, and there were others who had been looking at it that way since 1910.
I'm not going to go and make that statement because I'd be hard put, having looked for it, to find a lot of that.
Okay.
What happened in the years before the park was created in 1919 was a lot of people, including people like John Muir, as well as John Wesley Powell, who wanted the park to be protected. And there were, here's another player, the Santa Fe Railroad.
Okay.
When they built the railroad, they gave half the sections, called the checkerboard sections, to the railroad to help them pay for it. And so chunks of the Grand Canyon were owned by the Santa Fe. It was a pain for the Santa Fe. It was no advantage. They wanted to trade it for useful lands. So here was another person, another group of people, and also they were for the Santa Fe, of course, they were interested in the tourist traffic. So they wanted a park which would be an attraction to come and get on the Santa Fe and ride up to the Grand Canyon. So there were a lot of people with different ideas. There was a lot of ferment here.
Okay.
And now I'm going to stop and I'm going to go all the way back. But before I go all the way back, I'm going to ask your indulgence for just a few minutes while I try and reset all our minds as to what we're talking about here. And I'm taking you back, let's take 1882, because that's a good year. And in 1882, there were two signal events. The first event was a couple of Army officers had come across the plateau from creating the Havasupai Reservation down to the Havasupai and said to the Havasupai, well, whatever, we don't know for sure. And their job was to look at the Havasupai and its situation and get a sound idea for a reservation to protect them.
Okay.
They did that, and that was 1882, and it is what I think we now all recognize was a kind of scandalous error. The reasons for that are something that I deal with a lot in my blog, but I don't want to bother with here. All right, so here we have the Havasupai Reservation, 1882. That same year, John Wesley Powell, who had only recently gone to Washington to become head of the U.S. Geological Survey and head of the Ethnological Survey, somehow, well, I think what it was, the idea about a park percolated. Maybe when Yellowstone was created, not too short a time before that, that said to him, well, the Grand Canyon's worth a park too. And in 1882, he took basically a straight edge and drew 4 lines on a map, and somehow, we don't know the details, went to a new senator from Indiana, Benjamin Harrison, and said, Senator, would you like to help me out by introducing this bill to create a Grand Canyon National Park? And nobody knows why it was Harrison, but it was certainly Powell. We know for sure that it was Powell's idea. Now that quadrilateral latitudes and longitudes that Powell drew started decently far south of the rim. And it went over and it included Havasupai Canyon and a little bit farther. And for far to the north, quite far up the Kaibab, including Kanab Canyon, and to some degree over to the east to take in some of Marble, although there was no knowledge of that time of what features we were talking about. He just drew this big rectangle and said, here's a park. Would you mind introducing that? And he did. I mean, Benjamin Harrison did. It was sent to the Department of Interior, where the General Land Office looked at it and introduced what I'm going to call, pardon me, the bifurcation situation. Because when the General Land Office commented on this very large piece of land going into a national park, they had no comment that except that it was a good idea. They had no comment saying it was a good idea, except that it did not take account of the fact that this little reservation for the Havasupai had been created and should be excluded from the park. Now, that's 1882, and from that, the history of the Grand Canyon National Park and how it grew has been entangled. What I'm trying to say is that you cannot talk about the park and how it grew and was administered without talking about the Havasupai and the fact that they felt pretty much from the beginning that they were cheated out of a decent reservation, which would have, like the Wallapai Reservation, which would have included plateau lands, as well as the entire canyon down to the river. That would have been the generous thing, but the Army guys didn't do that. We can talk about that problem some other day.
Right.
But what we do have is a park being proposed, and we have an Indian reservation, the people of which living on it feel they can't live their real life. Because if they go up on the plateau, what's going to happen? They're going to run into the cattlemen, into the grazers, and they're going to have trouble. And they did have trouble. They ran into trouble with once the Forest Service got up there. How are they going to hunt? Going to have trouble. So the intricacies of how to deal with a great place like the Grand Canyon and a deserving people like the Havasupai residents of the Grand Canyon, if there ever have been residents in the recent times, it was certainly the Havasupai. So what I'm trying to get at is we cannot look at this history that we're talking about without thinking we got to split our minds. And we got to, on the one hand, say, park. How do we make a great park? And on the other hand, we have to say, and some people didn't, and I'm free to admit I was on the wrong side in the 1970s. How are we going to help the Havasupai? How are we going to fix that situation, which starting in 1882 was so bad? So that's the end of my lecture. But when I use the word bifurcation, what I'm talking about is something that in the legislation that we're talking about, the principal sponsor, Barry Goldwater, included a respect for the Havasupai, certainly, the Wallapai and the Navajo, and at the same time said, we're going to have a park. So he tried to straddle the bifurcation. And I think that will be our task in the future.
Yeah.
Sorry I had to go on about that, but I just have to get that off my chest.
No, it's good to put it together. One of the questions I had was besides the club, who else was an ally in a quest to make an integral park boundary?
When you lead so dramatically and get into such a position, you are apt to leave most people in the situation of saying, well, all right, you've claimed it, you do it. So therefore, of course, we had help from, say, the Wilderness Society,
Okay.
from the National Parks, what was then the National Parks Association. These were people who you'd expect them in the actual time of working in the legislation in the 1970s. Of course, the Sierra Club, and you also had small groups from Arizona, like hiking clubs from
Okay.
here in Tucson. So it was a broad range where you really get a sense of how wide-ranging the canyon's attraction is when you go into the records of the fight over the dam and you look through all the communications from all those organizations, not to mention newspapers and, of course, individuals all across the country, saying, don't dam the Grand Canyon, save Grand Canyon. So that's what really comes out. The work of making the park in 1972 to 75 was, and I don't claim this, I'm not looking for praise, because we probably would have done better if we'd had even more people involved in helping us directly on it. But were two people, me and my teammate, if you will, a man named John McComb, who had succeeded me as Southwest representative of the Sierra Club.
Okay. Let's go back to Goldwater for a minute.
Sure.
You mentioned that Barry was trying to bridge the park, or link up the park, if you will, with indigenous peoples and their territory, the Navajo in the east, the Hualapai in the southwest, and the Havasupai in the central, all on the south side of the river, or the east side of the river. Did Goldwater have this idea, or did you and the others?
This was Goldwater. His interest, and maybe it was paternalism in those days, the 1940s and 50s. I wouldn't want to guess, but he looked with favor on Indians.
Yes.
And so when we get to this bill, one of the things he wanted was to include provisions that respected the territory, the reservations. And one of the consequences of that is that there is a provision that says, in fact, I've got the legislation, well, never mind, I've got it right here if you need a quote, but basically what it says is any of the reservation lands cannot be taken into the park unless the tribal government concurs.
Okay.
And we all know no tribal government will do that. So it's almost a dead letter, but it was gesture. And he furthermore made a gesture by saying, I encourage the Secretary of the Interior, he said this in his legislation, and the bill authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to get his Park Service out and deal with those three nations that own more of the South Rim than the federal government includes, and work with them and make a whole better approach for the world to understand what the Grand Canyon is in its entirety. Because you can't do it if you do bifurcate, you can't understand the Grand Canyon. Those are political boundaries. You want to understand the Grand Canyon, you've got to straddle that divide, which Goldwater did in his bill, and say, here's an entity. let's see how we can protect and present it to the people.
Okay. I'm just curious, besides Goldwater, were there other legislators that really helped make this Enlargement Act happen?
There were, let me just give a couple of instances. I want to tip my hat off to a senator from New Jersey, a man named Clifford Case, who completely out of the blue came to us and said, I'm interested in the Grand Canyon. Can I introduce a bill? And we gave him the Sierra Club proposal, and that's how that got introduced, because this senator of New Jersey was particularly interested.
And he just approached you directly? You didn't go to him?
Yeah.
And just,
Yep, absolutely.
wow.
I mean, what's the surprise? Maybe he had visited or whatever he had done.
Exactly.
It blew his mind too, excuse
Huh.
the expression. I mean, how many millions did that do? He was in a position to make a difference by introducing this bill. So we had right from the beginning of the legislative process a bill out there that embodied our ideas.
Okay. Any other legislators that you remember?
And then, for instance, in the Senate consideration, there came a question of whether or not some lands in the Kanab Plateau, which had been grazed, but had then been put into the monument in the 1930s, whether those lands should stay in the new park. We wanted to leave them in. Senator Goldwater said, well, my friends, the cattlemen, really want them out. And we depended on what I'll say is the pro-park senators at that time to protect the park. Men like Frank Church of Idaho. Yes, there were things like that. It's when we get to the House that we get a total change of the sense of support. And that's because, of course, that's because of the difference between Goldwater as a legislator and the House principal sponsor, the sainted and revered Morris Udall of Arizona, who sponsored the bill in the House and, in fact, was the leader in getting it passed through the House.
Can you open that up a little bit?
Which part?
The differences between Goldwater and Udall?
Absolutely, because it was absolutely crucial. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bifurcate the history again, because basically what happened is Goldwater said, I want a park bill. And he called meetings at his house in December 1972 and January of 1973. These meetings included people like us who wanted to do it and people who were not so hot about it, Park Service people and so on. And Goldwater said, I want a park. And the chairman of the Senate Interior Committee says, I can have a park, I can have this legislation, but no controversy. Well, Tom, that is one of the funniest remarks, I think, in this entire thing, that anybody thought they could pick up the Grand Canyon as a concept and an issue and not have controversy. Nevertheless, that's what Goldwater said. I don't want controversy. And we, for a while, tried to work with that idea. We visited people and said, can we put something together that won't be controversial? However, and now here's the big thing about Goldwater. Goldwater was not a legislator. That is somebody who got involved in guiding and working through, perhaps negotiating, compromising, all the dirty stuff. Oh, that's a wrong thing to say. All the stuff that goes into grinding that sausage that we call the congressional process to make an act. And Goldwater, that was not his style. He didn't do that. So he turned it over to his chief aide, who was an expert on, I guess, on national security. He knew nothing about the Grand Canyon, nothing about natural resources, and even worse, he was a right-winger who hated conservationists.
Oh.
During this process, from the time I just mentioned, those meetings, up until the time that the Goldwater introduced his bill and started acting on it in, let's say, March of 1973, we tried to go to him. I mean, we didn't try to go to him, we went to him and said, can you show us what you've got? Can we talk about it? Can we get some feel for how our ideas are represented or not? Zilch, nothing. The man stiffed us, and he made it so clear that he didn't want to have anything to do with us. It was basically his bill. Now, this was the biggest mistake of the entire thing, because what it did was end up forcing us to say, okay, if we can't work with you, we'll throw away the compromising things, compromised things we're working on, and we'll just get behind our own bill. And so when there were hearings held, that's what we did. We came in, we condemned Goldwater's bill. Imagine that, we condemned the man who was supposed to be our ally and who asked us to work on it, because his aide had so alienated us, we didn't have any chance to contribute to what he was doing. And so we just came in and said, here's what we want. This is our complete Grand Canyon National Park, and this is what we want to fight for.
Let
me just finish that one up.
Yeah.
What happened was Goldwater got mad. Now, Goldwater got good about getting mad. He was also good at curbing his temper and being hail fellow well met after that. But the damage had been done. And for the rest of the 1970s, Goldwater treated us like enemies.
Did you, at that time, when you realized you had to come in with your own legislation, did you get a sense that the whole concept of enlarging the park might die?
No, because there was the House and Morris Udall.
Okay.
Now, I mean, the history of Morris Udall and the environment and the Grand Canyon and the dams and the park, I mean, talk about complex, but let's talk about Morris Udall as one of the great politicians of the US House of Representatives, certainly one of the great politicians that Arizona sent into Washington. This was a person who gloried in making legislation, who gloried in having the kind of staff that was competent, knowledgeable, politically aware enough that they could put together and bring together the parties and get them to, if not negotiate, at least to listen. That was the crucial thing. We knew as soon as the disaster of the Senate was completed in August. And that's what happened. It just rolled on for a few months. And then there were some funny things which we don't have time to talk about now, in which that aide of Goldwater's got his comeuppance. But the bill that went out of the Senate that was passed by the Senate was basically a dead letter, because we immediately went over to Morris Udall and we said, okay, that farce is out of the way. How do we get some real legislation? And he said, tell me what you want, and I'm going to assign you somebody to work on it.
Okay. So basically it was Udall who came to the rescue, if you will, as a way to get around what would have been a pretty bad bill coming out of the Senate side.
Right, let's look at it.
Okay.
Goldwater had crafted, Goldwater's aide, not even Goldwater.
Right.
As you know, Barry was a pilot. He liked to fly things. So he said, go make me an airplane called the Grand Canyon National Park. And his aide, who knew nothing about airplanes, crafted this thing which had no motor, which had half a wing. And he said, here, Barry, here's the Grand Canyon bill.
Hmm.
And Goldwater got into that piece of junk and he ran it down the runway, and it got a centimeter off the ground and crashed and burned. And that was the end of that, for any intents and purposes, of the Senate bill.
Hmm.
Now, the end result at the very end has some other aspects to it, but that we never had to consider the Senate bill at that time. We had to consider, how can we work with UDOL and get a true worthwhile Grand Canyon bill. Okay, having said all that, and I'm quite fierce about the bad. When I think about what might have happened if we'd had an aide similar to UDOL's aide in Goldwater's office,
Oh, gosh.
different story, totally different story. But we didn't have that. And so we basically were ready to do it. And it picked up in November when UDOL, announced that there would be hearings and that the action on the bill would be taken up by the Park Subcommittee in early 1974.
Okay. We've been going at this quite a while. I just have a couple more questions. There's clearly a huge topic.
It is a huge topic.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
As it looked like the bill was going to pass, were you able to make any final changes to it there in 74, 75?
What we were able to do with Goldwater, with UDOL and his aide and the Park Subcommittee in the House, was to craft a bill which kept some things that Goldwater had, like on overflights and the respect for the three nations. Those kinds of things we left in. I mean, you know, they were things he believed in too. But otherwise, in the House, we crafted a bill that included what we hoped would be as good as you could get. And I don't know, can you see? No, I guess it doesn't really show up. But if anybody's familiar with the Arizona Strip, which is the map on behind me, they know that there is a monument up there called Grand Canyon Parashon. The lower half of that, the lower 500,000 acres, is in some ways what we had in our legislation when we got UDOL support for it. That was taken out in the last minute fighting at the end, which is a story in and of itself. But what we had as we came out of the House was a sound piece of park legislation, which would have enshrined let me just say, all the available parks, because it didn't include any of the reservations. And the bifurcation exists. You can't include the reservations in a national park.
Right.
So yes, we got at that point what we could, but the politics of the end game got against us.
So here we are, almost 50 years, 47 years after the passage of the legislation. As you look at the Grand Canyon today, how well do you think the 75 Enlargement Act served the Grand Canyon?
We were, because of the, again, as I say, the end game, we were very downhearted when the bill passed, because we thought we had a chance to add significant areas on the north side, which we didn't. Nevertheless, the additions that were made, for instance, putting the totality of the Colorado River surface into the park, again, protecting the rights of the Navajo, Havasupai, and Wallapai. And of course, again, the Havasupai is an entirely different story, which we're not even touching on here. The idea that overflights ought to be curtailed was in that bill, even though it took death before people got serious about it. What I have lamented since that time is that that bill was an invitation to the Park Service administration at Grand Canyon, that is to say, acting for the secretary, to work with those three nations and other people around to enlarge how the Park Service deals with informing, educating, preparing, working with people to interpret and protect the canyon. That's explicitly in the bill, but the Park Service has never really taken that challenge up. The north side is, I think, the best indication. The north side needs a superintendent of the Park Service who will work with the Forest Service and BLM. You know, that whole land back there is a huge stretch of magnificent public land. And not to look at it as a whole and to try and get some regional sense of what to do to protect it and so it doesn't get overdeveloped and degraded. I'd love to see that. But the Park Service doesn't think that way. When it thinks North Rim, it thinks of a ranger over there on the, in the, what they call the North Rim. And it's not anything like the North Rim. It's just a little piece of it there. So that's a shortcoming of vision on the part of the research of the Park Service.
Let me come back to this question again, maybe with a little different angle.
Okay.
How you felt when the bill was signed versus how you feel today about the legislation. Are they the same?
Not at all. I felt when the bill was signed that we had nothing but work to do. So in that sense, it's true, because we had nothing but work to do. There were 4 studies that were going to be conducted that we had to deal with. We had to get people to agree with how the bill is to be interpreted and administered. And that was just a lot of stuff to do dealing administratively with, like, the Park Service. The feeling was one of, all right, let's get to work. Today, it's still, let's get to work. Because what we've done from 1882, well, let me put it this way. What we did from 1882 to 1975 was we restored the Havasupai. We repatriated land to the Havasupai that they should have had 70 years earlier. And we created some of the land, some of the park, but I'm not satisfied. That's why we wanted that other land to be added. We still wanted the Grand Canyon National Park, Grand Canyon Parashon National Monument. Half of it is Grand Canyon and ought to be in the park.
Okay.
So there's a future task. So I feel today the same way I felt then. There's work to do. The Grand Canyon is a work in progress.
Well, it's interesting, as someone who came in after the 75 Enlargement Act and saw the park from Lee's Ferry to the Grand Wash, I just want to thank you for what you and the people you worked with, McComb and Brower and Martin Litton and aides of Udall, et cetera, to do what you've done, to do what you did. I just want to thank you for that. Yes, there is, I think of Kanab, I think of Racetrack Knoll and that, you know, that wonderful area there. And go, wow, why isn't that in Grand Canyon National Park? What's going on out there? Yes, there is work to be done, but I just think if you guys hadn't done what you did in the 70s, we would be way behind the 8 ball today. So I want to thank you for that.
And again, thank you to you and your audience for listening to me. It's pretty obvious that this is a subject, and if we had more participants who are knowledgeable about this, we could really have a good discussion, but it would go on for hours and hours.
It would.
Days and days. We should have a symposium.
Yeah, a symposium on Grand Canyon. Well, that's going to happen here soon. What I'd like to do now is open this platform up to questions from the people that are here. And that means I need to play with some of the switches. So bear with me for a minute. Because what I'd like to do is unmute everyone. Anybody who knows how to unmute everyone, oh, let's see, that's mute all. How can I unmute all? Allow participants to unmute themselves. Yes. All right, everybody should be able to unmute themselves. And if you have a question for Jeff, I encourage you to bring it on.
I have one. This is Rich Turner. What do you believe there's some controversy over what the native boundary is now, whether it's mid-river, the edge of the river, historic high water mark. What do you believe is the boundary between the reservations and the park right now in terms of Inner Canyon?
Hang on, Jeff. Hang on, Jeff. We need to unmute you. I'm not sure how that happened.
I did it. Didn't
Got it.
I do it? Okay.
You're good.
Okay. There are two places along the park where the river boundary is a great subject for lawyers. Goldwater's intention was, the thing he stated was, I want unified administration and jurisdiction over river traffic in Grand Canyon National Park. Now, those weren't his exact words, but those are the kinds of things he was saying to us and to the Park Service people at his meetings. In order to accomplish that, the idea was for along the Havasupai Reservation to take the boundary of the park, not the boundary of the reservation, but the boundary of the park, and move it across so that all the water surface. So the boundary is on the south bank and all the water surface is inside the park. The same thing, I would argue, is also true for the Navajo country. But that is both more complicated because of the history of it. And there is no question the Department of Interior lawyers do not agree with me. And the question is whether we're going to, if we ever get to a point where we have a real controversy, somebody gets arrested, something happens because somebody desecrates somebody's land, somebody doesn't obey the Navajo or the Wallapai. And if we then reach the point where we go to court, the question is this something we want to take to court and adjudicate there in front of a judge, and then another judge, and then maybe even the Supreme Court? Because as I say, when you start with the Grand Canyon, you just got controversy. So although I believe that all of the river surface is inside the park, under the park's jurisdiction without taking any of that land along the Navajo or the Wallapai side, as there are lawyers who don't agree with me.
Does
Thank
that
you.
answer your question, Rich?
Yes, to a great extent.
Well, okay.
No, I know the act said on the Navajo side that the boundaries should be with their approval. Was it a quarter mile back from the river or something to that effect? But it was never followed through on whether the tribe would agree to that or not.
Well, it's actually worse than that, because there was a Navajo boundary before 1975. It was set up by the a Boundary Act in 1934 for the Navajo Reservation. And that is the boundary that exists. And the question is, how do you interpret? And the whole business of the quarter mile is exactly the thing I'm talking about when I say lawyers disagree with me. I say it's Navajo land because that's, to me, what the language in the legislation and other things say. That piece of, in the 1975 Act that says it goes up to the rim is, I'm sorry to say, in the sense that it would be nice to have it in the park. It's not in the park, it's not going to be in the park, and it just would confuse anybody. The Navajo are not confused. They know it's their land. And well, it's just one of those things we've got to hope that we can negotiate and talk about if it ever gets to the point of difficulty and conflict.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Again, you can unmute your mic and feel free to jump in here.
Muted here.
Sorry, Susie, did you say something?
Okay, I just wanted to thank you. This was really, really a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it so much. And, you know, I'm very interested in, because our family had so many interactions with Carl Hayden, with Barry Goldwater, with Morris Udall, you know, because of the complexities of concession law. I love nothing more than, you know, diving around in the details of legislation and personalities and so on. So I really enjoyed it so much. And I also just appreciated your even-handedness in discussing all this complex cast of characters. So thank you a lot.
Well, I trust my younger self is not listening, because if so, he'll probably give me a kick tonight. Go ahead. Yes, I think that's a tremendously important point, and thank you for your comments, because we've got to take the attitude that the Grand Canyon is this place we, whether you say revere or want to play around in or whatever. And the only way we can do it is if we work about it together, if we just start thinking it's a thing to argue over. Well, to argue over, we can't fully realize its potential. Oh no, the potential of the world to understand and appreciate. To me, it stands as an environmental icon in a time where the environment is under enough threat that we need places that we can say about, if we can't save this, what can we say?
Yeah. I'd also just like to express my appreciation too for all your efforts over the years. I mean, it's to get to be in the weeds and keep your balance and your perspective and get things done is really admirable.
You're very, I appreciate your comments, certainly.
Hey, Jeff, you mentioned a website, a blog that you've got. What's the address of that website?
If you, the title of it is Celebrating Grand Canyon. And
So-
if you put into a search engine, Jeff Ingram and Grand Canyon, the blog spot Celebrating Grand Canyon will be one of the ones that come up. And it's got a topic list. When the screen comes up, it'll have a topic list at the top. And one of the topics is park history, which all the stuff I've talked about tonight comes out is an attempt to tell how it all happened.
Okay, so search Jeff Ingram, Celebrating Grand Canyon.
Yeah, that would do it.
Awesome, great. Questions?
Yeah, this is Peter Corbett. Wanted to ask about your view of what can happen at the development of the tram that's been proposed over the years, and how do you view the best way to deal with that issue and to protect that area?
As you know, we had a perhaps active, perhaps just speculative activity about a tram in the last few years over at the Little Colorado Junction on the Navajo part of the Grand Canyon. And the Navajo, in their own way, served that issue beautifully. And the end result was that from the local level all the way up to the tribal government legislature, they took it up and said no and no. Now, if you're not a Navajo, that could be a little frustrating because you can't participate. But that's the kind of attitude toward a tramway that I think is appropriate. So let me tell you just a little story about one of the original proposals. Somebody came, and this was after the Park Service had been created, and Stephen Mather was the director. And somebody with big ideas came to him and said, you know, we could build a tramway down to the bottom and blah, 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 blah. Wonderful. Oh, let's see all this stuff. And so Mather got excited and said, well, maybe this would be a great idea. And he took the idea into the Secretary of the Interior. Now, the irony of this is the Secretary of the Interior at that time was the man who, when he had been working a few years before for San Francisco, was behind the Hetch Hetchy, was one of the pushers of the Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite National Park. But he took one look at Mather being excited about this tramway, and he said, in essence, are you crazy, Mather? You can't put a tramway in the Grand Canyon. That would ruin the whole point. And so that proposal was scotched. I think that is a kind of a easy answer, is just to say every time you hear the word tramway, and well, let me just say that, say no.
Mhm.
It does point up that what I mean when I say the Grand Canyon is a work in progress, because it's also a work in progress for people who want to exploit it. Now, you'd say, oh, well, they can't build dams in there, can they anymore? Well, no, but there are some, again, speculators, whatever they are, who are talking about pump storage projects in Little Colorado. I mean, loony ideas pop up. And to me, you've got to be able to say no.
Thank you.
Thank you for raising that question. Yeah.
Any more questions for Jeff? Well, with that, hearing none, Jeff Ingram, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to visit with us and to recount your activities in the 1975 Enlargement Act of Grand Canyon National Park. Thank you so very, very much for your service to the Grand Canyon, your life of advocacy and dedication to the Grand Canyon. And I just really want to thank you for all that you've done.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been a good life. It's a great worthwhile.
It's 7:21. Just gonna kind of kick around for the next 5 minutes or so, and then we'll probably wrap this meeting up a little before 7:30. And you're all, let's see, I'm gonna play with some switches. You're all welcome to turn on your videos if you'd like. If I can figure out how to do it, you're all welcome to chat amongst yourselves. And we're just gonna hang out for a couple more minutes.
While we have I have just a quick, Jeff, if I may.
Yes, please.
I know you've written some of this history previously, but have you thought about trying to formalize what your knowledge about, especially this whole development of the boundaries, into another publication?
You mean a book?
Yes.
My purpose in doing the blog was almost to avoid writing the book, because when I wrote my book on the river, which was in a sense just a piece, the 1970s was the center of it, it became very large and very detailed. And I would love to work with somebody who can write concisely and beautifully and wisely and do a history of the park, who had no fear of stopping me and cutting out and just putting down the essentials. But I don't believe I can do it. What I have done in the blog is that the tabs themselves are organized so that if you click on one, the separate entries come up as if they were in a book, in book order. That's the best I've been able to do. If anybody wants to volunteer to be editor, I'd love to work with them.
Yeah, and I greatly appreciate the blog. I've referred to it and read many parts of it over the years, and I guess, like many historian people with care about history, you know, I worry about the long-term preservation of that knowledge in a digital format. And so far, books have proven to be rather resilient to change. And so as much as I appreciate the blog, I just think that having it in a book form could really be a valuable contribution to history in general. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I agree with you. And not to make a point out of it, if I weren't 84, if I were, let's say, 54, well, anyway, I agree with you.
Helen, what are you doing these days?
I'm continuing to be an employee of the U.S. Geological Survey, working on the effects of Glen Canyon Dam on the downstream ecosystem.
How would you like to work as an editor with Jeff Ingram?
Perhaps as a retirement project, but I'm not quite there yet.
Well, you could
As
start now.
an employee of the USGS, I would be in a very tenuous position to try to contribute to that very controversial history.
Maybe you could start now and get things going so that it was published the day you retired.
Right.
About that.
Okay, I'm out of here.
All right, see you, Dick.
Do you want any more wine?
Okay, wait a minute.
Well, with that, we should probably go ahead and wrap this up. This will then conclude another virtual outing of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. You can become a member too if you're not, and check out the website, grandcanyonhistory.org. Again, thank you to Jeff Ingram and Haley Johnson and Rich Turner, and also to all of you who attended tonight. Thank you all so much for coming. And with that, we will, I'll turn off the